Then we're going to look at why do we need pre-registration? Why am I asking you to do an extra step? We'll look at the practicalities of how to do pre-registration. Then I'm going to give you a brief intro to register reports, which are slightly different to pre-registrations, but we'll come on to that. And then we'll look at some of the potential barriers you might face. So, firstly, what is pre-registration? This is really simple. Pre-registration is literally the act of registering your plans pre-implementation. So that can be any part of your plans. So if you, the reason there's a napkin there is because if you are in a coffee shop and you write down your hypothesis on a napkin, technically speaking, that is pre-registration. If you just write down the target population you want to recruit from, that kind of thing, that definitely counts as pre-registration. However, we generally wouldn't encourage that. So I'm going to come on and talk to you a little bit more about what the more recommended way of doing it is in a bit. So firstly, now I'm asking you to do an extra step in your research process, so I have to have a justification. So why do I want you to do this? Well, this is the issue. This is a real study that was done in the University of Pennsylvania, where they asked 20 undergraduates to listen to either When I'm 64 by the Beatles or Kalimba, which is this little instrument in the corner there. And they managed to show very convincingly that after listening to the Beatles, people were a year and a half younger than after they listened to Kalimba, with a p-value of 0.04, which is relatively decent in psychology. So what happened? This happened. So this is an expanded abstract. So the abstract that was published was the one that I've just shown you, and that's in bold. Everything that's not in bold is what actually happened. So they excluded 14 participants. We don't know why they did that. They excluded a condition. They conducted their analyses after every 10 participants and published when they eventually got a significant result. And the list goes on for quite a few things. I haven't done the maths, but I'm pretty sure that adds up to more than 100 variations of ways that they could analyze these results, which means that the p-value of 0.04 indicates that basically they run 100 things and they picked one of the 4 that was significant. And that's how they ended up with this clearly absurd result. But you can imagine if that was something that's a little bit less absurd, that could quite easily slip through the cracks. So, I just want to show that this does have a real impact. These are a bunch of stories that have ended up in the news recently. You can see that most of these are going to be from social sciences. So I did want to have a quick look at whether this is an issue outside of the social sciences, because I'm from the social sciences, so I wasn't sure. So I spent some time just Googling a bunch of stuff, and I wanted to look at kind of whether there was any evidence of something akin to a replication crisis or a replication issue in different disciplines. So any of so this is a list of all of the departments from Reading University, and I looked into all of them. Does anyone want to pick one, and let's see whether, not all of them did, but shall we see which ones do?
How about pharmacy?
Okay, let's have a look. So so I managed to find something. You can see here there's this study that found that the original studies, as opposed to replication attempts, generally report larger effects. Two practices reporting the efficient. The original study were found to be harmful in one reproduction attempt. So there's this. There's also a study here where, again, this is about, so in pharmacy, there's academic research and then there's industry research. So this study looked at the difference between academic research, who is generally, unfortunately, we live in a publication system where it is good for us to get positive results, whereas in-house, so in industry, they don't want to get, they want their results to be true more than they want their results to be positive. So this study looked at the difference between industry research and academic research, and it just compares. So you can see the inconsistencies. 65% of academic papers had inconsistencies when replicated in commercial settings. So I'll just quickly go back. We could do that for a long time, but the pink here is they're the ones where I did manage to find evidence that there might be some questionable research practices that are happening in those disciplines. So it's not all of them. And the ones that are black don't necessarily mean there aren't any. They just mean that I couldn't find any in a day of Googling stuff. So moving on. I'm hoping that that has kind of indicated a little bit of why we need to pre-register things. So I want to move back to how do we pre-register. I've mentioned that technically just writing your hypothesis is a pre-registration, but realistically that's not going to give you the best outcome. So what do you actually need to include in a pre-registration? And I've adapted this from a study by Simmons 2011, which is linked at the bottom here, but you want to include as a bare minimum the rule for data collection termination, a list of all variables, all experimental conditions, outlier exclusion rules, and any covariates to be recorded. Those adaptations are from the original, the two abstracts that I showed you. So basically, this is what they said needs to happen to avoid that twisted result that they got. But basically, all it is you should pre-register as much as possible. It's not going to be possible to pre-register everything, but everything you can. I've also just popped a link in there to the OSF, which is the Open Science Framework. I'm going to talk about that in a sec, but it's a place to pre-register studies, and they've got generic templates and they've got specific templates because pre-registration is going to be different depending on the discipline that you're at, the methodology you're at, that kind of thing. And I've also included this little, 15-minute video of a walkthrough of exactly how to pre-register on OSF, just in case that's how your brain works, because that's how my brain works. Now, I have mentioned the OSF. I'm going to mention the OSF a lot because that's the one that I'm familiar with, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best one. So we do have the OSF. We've also got a couple of others that I've heard referenced and colleagues have used. So As Predicted is one where I've never used it, but from sort of feedback from colleagues, it's where it's a smaller template, which allows you a bit more flexibility. So maybe for experimental designs and that kind of thing. And then there's Zenodo, which again, I think is more a little bit more about computer science. And I'm not super familiar. I'm just sort of highlighting that there are lots of different repositories that are out there for pre-registrations. Now, when to pre-register? Ideally, you should always pre-register as soon as possible, right? But I understand that some of you might be into your project already when you're hearing about this, and that's fine. So realistically, when can you pre-register? You might do it after pilots, that's fine. You might do it before, if you're doing multiple rounds of data collection, it's fine to pre-register from a particular point in that. If you're doing secondary data, you could do that before you start analysing an already existing data set. Or possibly after a literature search is also completely fine. But what's important is that you're explicit. You need to let the person who's reading your pre-registration know that this is where you are. The next thing that comes up quite often is, what do I do if I have a pre-registration and then I need to change my plan, which very much happens, right? Your first option is be a fortune teller, which we can't do. So your second option is update your pre-registration when big changes occur. That's possible on OSF, and as far as I'm aware, all of the other repositories to put your pre-registrations in, it basically just comes up in a little yellow box at the top saying on this particular day this update was made to the pre-registration. So it just helps with transparency. So if you do need to exclude some participants in a way that you didn't predict, that's fine. It just means that the person who is reading your pre-registration can see that and make a judgment on whether that was a justified change or something you're kind of sort of succumbing to confirmation bias, let's say. The last one is you could not even consider it while you're doing it, and you could just delineate between planned and unplanned analyses in the final paper. So I've got some examples here. This particular one said the original plan was to conduct a single manoeuvre, and then they switched it to two separate manoeuvres, and they've explained that at the bottom. Another one, they explained that they accidentally collected 4 additional participants, but they wanted to explain why, so that people didn't think that they had just repeatedly run until they got a positive result. You can see that in this one, they even did actually perform the analysis without those and showed that it didn't make a difference. Or finally, this particular one, which is a pre-registered analytic plan failed spectacularly in just about every way possible, but is available at OSF. Which is also possible. So I understand that we work within a system where we need to get things published. So I've found a paper that's looking at how do journal editors and reviewers see changes when you report them. So they asked these people to imagine that the authors of a pre-registered study deviated from their pre-registered plan in one or more ways. The authors report the deviations along with an explanation for why they deviated in the manuscript. And they asked the participants to think about how they would understand that. So I'm just going to give you a warning here. This is not a really satisfying result. Editors indicated that deviations would not affect their perception or even slightly positively affect their perception of the manuscript, which is great. Basically what that's saying is if you report deviations, people think you're being more honest. 38% of editors noted that it depends about whether it would affect their perception of the manuscript. So this is the unsatisfying answer that I'm talking about. But if you look at the reasons, they do make sense. So the magnitude of the deviation, the plausibility that the deviation was strategic, as in strategic to allow for publication, and whether the authors appropriately calibrated their conclusions, whether they said, yeah, we did. There was a deviation, and that could affect. It would be better for this study to be run as it was predicted, that kind of thing. And then the big one, would it affect their editorial decisions? Somewhat. Again, very unsatisfying, I'm sorry. But when you look into it, again, it's the stuff that kind of makes sense. The significance of the deviation, whether it was an improvement or deterioration of the original plan, and whether the deviation was transparently disclosed and justifiable. So again, it's all about looking trustworthy, which is great. That's what we want. Cool. So that's pre-registration. I now want to move on to registered reports, which is a slightly different thing. It's basically the same but more formal. So with a registered report, you develop an idea, you design the study, you submit a stage 1 peer review. This is a pre-registration. There's an annoying change in language here, but a stage 1 peer review is essentially a pre-registration. It's just a plan of exactly what you're going to do very explicitly. Then you submit that plan before you've done anything to a journal who will peer review it for you. And they'll say, yes, once the peer reviewers have looked at it, they'll say, yes, we will accept your publication regardless of the outcome, provided you stick to this plan. Or again, you can justify why you haven't stuck to the plan. Again, it's peer review, so there's a possibility for revise and submit, but apart from that, it's a standard submit it, and then journals will say, yes, you can do this. You then collect and analyze your data as normal, you write the report as normal, and then you go to a stage 2 peer review, which is the standard peer review, apart from in a registered report, all the reviewers are going to be looking at is, did you do what you said you would do? or have you justified why you have made changes? And then you will be able to publish your report regardless of whether you get the null results. So a couple of places that you can do this. The Centre for Open Science, which runs the OSF, has a list of about 300 participating journals at the point of me writing these slides. The link is there. It's updated regularly. So I'd recommend going and having a look whether your target journals are there. The other option is you can do peer community. So RR's registered reports in peer community are slightly different, and I've dedicated a slide to it because it's a great little resource where even if you're not submitting to this particular website, they've got loads of instructions about how to write these things. But basically, peer community is an online website where they have some journals that have agreed to participate with them. You submit your abstract, just your abstract, 6 weeks abstract to your pre-registration, 6 weeks before you're ready to actually publish your pre-registration. In that 6 weeks, this website will find reviewers for you who will then commit to a 2-week turnaround of the initial peer review. Which means when you submit your pre-registration, you will have an answer within those 2 weeks. And then it's the same process. There's journals that have agreed to do so. I'm not going to list them because again, it's being updated very regularly. Now, what should you include? This is largely a link to a resource. I'm not going to go through all of these 10, but I just wanted to link you to this research because it's a really good kind of step-by-step exactly what you need to include in your registered report. Does it work? So we said that we wanted to do this so that we could reduce publication bias and not have all of those nasty headlines that popped up on the screen. A couple of studies have looked at this. This one is a review of a bunch of different registered reports and traditional literature. The red dot on the right-hand side is looking at the percentage of null findings in traditional literature, so non-registered reports. And you can see that's sort of between 5 to 20%. If you take all registered reports, that is the dark purple dot on the left, and you can see it's kind of hovering between 50 and 70% of publications that do report null findings. So that's great. Well, that means two things. Firstly, it means that registered reports are going to work for you in that you are more likely to be able to publish your null findings if you do it this way. And the second thing it means is that that's likely the impact of publication bias, right? So that's about 40% or something very roughly, which is huge. And it's not great that that's there to begin with, but it is good that it means that it's looking like we've got something of a solution for it. There's just this other one that is sort of the same study done by different people, highlighting the same thing. So you've got on the right, you've got registered reports where roughly 40% of papers do not support the initial hypotheses versus about 95% that do in standard reports. So we've got some time here, so I'm gonna look at some of the cons. I do have time, don't I? Yeah. So what are the cons? This is maybe the wrong wording for me actually, but what are the barriers is what I'm thinking about. I've collected some that are those that have been kind of raised to me when I'm talking about these kind of things. So they're not it's not all inclusive, but it should be most of the key ones that are coming up. So will it prevent exploratory discoveries? Lots of people do exploratory research. And that can be a concern because there's this impression that pre-registration prevents you from doing those. Now, what I want to be clear about here is that registered reports have been found to be of higher rigor and quality, but equal novelty. So it doesn't seem to be that registered reports are preventing people from being creative. What about pre-registered studies? You can still do explanatory analyses. You just need to state what these analyses are. Like I said, we do live in this imperfect system, so it might be that that's less impressive to your reader, and that's true. I don't have a solution to that. If you say, I didn't actually expect this, I didn't know this was going to happen, it might mean that your reader believes what you're saying a little bit less, but arguably that's a good thing, because you want your reader to understand all of the potential. You want your reader to look at your stuff critically. So yes, that is a possibility. You just need to think about what's more important. Is it more important that the reader trusts what you're saying, or that the reader has all the information? This will take too much time. I know there's a huge problem at the moment where researchers have so much admin to do and they don't have time to fill in yet another form. There is an argument this just shifts time around, in that you should always be planning what you're doing and your analyses and everything at some point. It just means that you do this at the beginning rather than at the end. And that means that you've got everything planned, and actually it should save you time, because you will hopefully come across fewer barriers along the way. You'll have predicted all of the things that will come up. The other thing I'd say is, particularly for registered reports, it's going to help with journal hopping. It's going to save time for the publication process at the end. And it's also going to save time to have your whole plan written so that your co-authors and you are all on the same on the same page. Now, what if you want to publish in a journal that does blind peer review? What if you don't know what journal you want to publish in? Well, OSF has an embargo option. I'm not going to say all of them have an embargo option because I don't know, but I think they do. It just means that you can put your pre-registration up and then embargo it so that people won't be able to see it until you've published your final report. Analyses depends on the data. What if you need to look at your data before you know what analyses can do? Publish a decision tree, pre-register a decision tree is the best option there. It might have a lot of different branches, or maybe it won't, but it's best to just pre-register what you know. What if your supervisor doesn't want to do this? Yeah, fair enough. So start with the registered reports. In my experience, having in principle acceptance to a publication is most people say yes to this. People like this. So I would recommend introducing them to registered reports and frame it as, this means we're more likely to get a publication. The other option I would suggest is write your pre-registration first and then present it to them. It's much easier to say no to something that's sort of abstract and a little bit scary. Also, pre-registrations, even if you never publish them, are quite helpful for yourself. It helps with confirmation bias. It helps with that thing that I was talking about earlier about making sure everybody's on the same page with where they're going. We spoke about p-hacking, which is when you switch up the analyses you do to get a positive result. And what if you're confident you're not p-hacking, and you don't feel this is necessary to you, which, to be clear, is most people, right? Like, I do not think most people are maliciously doing this deliberately. However, a lot of hacking, which is hypothesizing after the results are known, is accidental. It's human. We naturally look for things to make sense to us, and we naturally want the things that we have done to work. We're in psychology, we should be aware of this, but I think the confirmation bias is quite well known. I'm not saying that anybody is doing this more than anybody else. That I didn't do that bit, so we'll move on. But the one other thing is that if you're not convinced, I would suggest for your next study, just do it for yourself in a Word document. And And then once you've so do it for yourself in a Word document at the beginning. And once you've collected your results, go back and have a look at it and just see whether your thinking is still the same for however many months on it is. The other thing is that this is catching on. It's already mandatory in clinical trials and it's becoming increasingly common in other disciplines. So the more we do it, the more we make it less acceptable for other people to not do it. So even if you think you're not p-hacking or harking, we still like the idea of doing it because that small number of malicious researchers, we're making it more difficult for them not to do it. The other, yes, this, I don't know if you can see that, but this is a paper written by a lady who initially proposed power poses. I don't know if you're aware of that, but it made it onto Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is my favorite TV show. And so it was quite big. Like a lot of people have heard of power poses. And she went back and reanalyzed all her data and realized it was utter nonsense. And she has spent the rest of her life trying to get across the point that this was a complete artifact of accidental p-hacking. So if you want to avoid this kind of thing, pre-registration is a really good way of doing that. And then finally, will it fit my research? So sometimes, like I speak a lot about p-hacking and quantitative research, but there's qualitative research. It's really helpful for registering reflexivity and tracking reflexivity. You might not be able to p-hack in qualitative research, but you can definitely hypothesize after the results are known. You can definitely make links in your head. So it's a really good idea to write down on paper, this is what I thought at the beginning. Has my mind changed? Have I been convinced? Have I learned things, or have I just fit in what participants have said to fit what I already think? Secondary data relies on you to be honest about what you know. So if you're doing a pre-registration with secondary data, it is possible that you've already seen the results and then you pre-register as if you haven't. And the best thing I can say, there's two options. So some databases, you are granted access. So if you can pre-register before you're granted access to the data, that's a really good idea. Otherwise, you just have to be honest. And exploratory research we've already touched on. It can be really helpful to pre-register your reflexivity. But you can also pre-register just the variables, even if you're not going to pre-register the exact statistical tests you're doing. And commercially funded research is another issue that I know is in some fields. And again, I would go back to the embargo. You can embargo your pre-registration until your funders have had time to make money off it. That's fine. So the final thing is that not everything is suitable. This is a tool to help you and others be confident in your quality, but it's not something that I would say that absolutely everybody has to do. Personally, I'd like as many people to do it as possible because that makes it more difficult for other people to not do it. And I am not aware of any real reasons not to do it. I'm sure there are some, I just haven't thought of any. But I think it's usually, unless there's a really good reason not to do it, there's no negatives. That's my final thing. There is a feedback code here for the UKRN who provided this training. That it would be